Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we're always learning things about ourselves, right? I mean, hopefully that's part of life as you grow and you figure out things that maybe you didn't know you were good at, and then you find out you're good at it, and that maybe you thought were totally working, and then gradually you figure out, that might not have been as effective as I thought. Maybe sarcasm and me go that way. I've had friends for a long time just jokingly be like, I'm sorry, I cannot always tell when you're being sarcastic because I'll crack a joke or something. I catch them flat-footed and they don't know. Or I say something that I really mean and they go to laugh. And gradually I've figured out, they're holding up a mirror to me here. And there are certain figures of speech that you mean to use to include people and have everybody in on the laugh and to make a sharp point. But these are sharp verbal instruments, and if not wielded with great precision, there can be a little bit of ambiguity there. Or if wielded in one setting, it might be crystal clear, but given a little bit of time or a different circle of people, maybe it becomes a little trickier to sort through. I think that is at the heart of the debate that we've been looking at, inspired by our trip through Matthew 26 here and the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper that we're looking at in verses, specifically 26, 27, 28, 29. You got a really important thing that Jesus says here that I think could really only be read one of two ways, right? He says, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he says, he takes the cup and the wine in it. He says, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So either he is doing the much more commonplace thing, which is to say something that sounds far beyond the pale of physical reality and using a very sharp metaphor that everyone in the room would have understood to have been illustrative of the sacrifice that he's about to make on the cross, of him as the fulfillment of the Old Testament sacrificial system, of this new meal as the fulfillment of the Passover. Or everybody in the room, in the original audience, would have understood this to be not a metaphorical statement, but an absolutely literal statement that bread he was holding is his body, even though it would have looked like bread. And that cup he's holding with the wine in it is his blood, even though it looked a lot like wine. Now, look, if you already got a horse in this race, one of those two things is just going to sound absurd and insane. Like, it can't be that. And the other's going to sound like, obviously, it's got to be that. But come on, wherever you're coming from, outside of Christianity, coming from the more symbolic view of this, coming from the high church, real presence view of this, no matter how you slice it, if you step back from that for 1 second, you got to admit it's a little bit trickier than maybe some folks in your camp give it credit for. I totally see how someone could look at the whole of the Bible and the whole of the history of Christianity and philosophy and be like, yeah, normally if you say something that outlandish, that would be a metaphor, but in this case, it's not. He definitely meant there's some kind of transformation that occurs. He doesn't clarify exactly how that happens here, but that's definitely what he's intoning. I get how people could see it that way. I can't help that I don't think that. When I read it, when I look at history and reason and philosophy and theology, what I see there is him saying that this is one more level of how he is the fulfillment and completion of all of these story arcs. In a way, he is all of the elements of all of the stories that point toward his work on the cross and the resurrection, because he is the rounding out of all of the stories. He's the missing piece, the bop to all of the bop-ba-da-da-bops of the entire Old Testament. And so for him to use this very sharp metaphor, to me, that reads very naturally. And what he's saying here is that the body and blood is the real body and blood that are about to be sacrificed on the cross, and that the efficacy of what is about to happen there is something that gives life and conquest over the grave and rightness with God to any who would respond to it. And as always, I like to turn over my cards so you know who you're dealing with, so that you can just take that with a grain of salt, because the exercise here, as we have discussed many times, is not I solved Christianity by reading some books and thinking real hard, and now I'm going to tell you how everything is. Instead, the exercise is it's the internet, and we're going to game it out together, and ultimately You can go and dig and read and think through all of the things, and you're going to land where you're going to land. And we're going to be at peace with each other, and you're going to go through whatever process you need to go through in all of that. So all of that said, if the Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and some others' position is real presence, that is that there is an actual transformation, and Jesus meant this absolutely literally, and there is no metaphor here, or maybe they might say that the metaphor is there, but it's very, very secondary, then the position held by the vast majority of Protestants, and by my estimation as somebody who likes the history of Christianity and theology, many people in the early church as well, this other position would be, I guess, the symbolic position, the not real presence position, the idea that the real presence of God is in the life of the kingdom citizen, and that there is no transformation that occurs when the elements of communion are prayed over. The person who holds this position would look at a passage like the one we're looking at and be like, okay, well, take and eat. This is my body. All right, but he's saying that with his body. So like clearly his physical body, his lips are moving, his tongue is moving, and he's holding the bread with his actual body, and that is actually distinct from the piece of bread that he's holding in his hand. And we know that he has the capacity to transmute things from one thing into another thing, water into wine, for example, a few fish into a lot more fish. And there's no indication here or anywhere in church history that such a miraculous transmutation is occurring. So the very fact that we got the Clark Kent Superman thing going here, where it's like, well, have you ever seen the two of them in the same place? And in this case, well, yeah, I have seen the communion bread and the literal body of Jesus in the same place at the same time, or at least I've seen it that way on the page. So that would lend credence to the idea that he is employing metaphor here, as he's employed so many other times in talking about himself as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets in the Old Testament story. Correspondingly, obviously, same deal, the wine continued to be wine. There's no indication that it was physically transmuted into blood at this point. So every indication from the text is that the first Lord's Supper does not involve people literally consuming the body and blood of Christ. And I suppose folks who read this as a metaphor, read this as a symbolic thing, would probably first point to that. And then you got John 6. John 6 is really important. I do not have time to read all of it today. And also, even if I did, I just want you to go and read it, because especially the second half of John 6 has so much to do with Jesus really pushing the gas pedal on, no, like, this sounds weird, but you gotta eat my flesh and drink my blood. I'll read you a little bit of it. I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Wow. Wow. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me, I know how that sounds if you're an outsider, it's bold language, will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever. Now, look, I get how somebody could read what I just read and be like, that sounds very literal. And right after this, the disciples are like, what? And Jesus is saying, like, does this offend you? And he pushes even harder on it. And a lot of my friends who would interpret Jesus' words at the Last Supper as being literal, this is my body and this is my blood, would go right over to John 6 and be like, look, he's still pushing it. And the disciples, like, they understood him and they were offended. They wouldn't have been offended if he was using some kind of metaphor. And I get where they're coming from there, but if you read just a little bit further in John 6, like the next sentence, well, then he goes to language that sounds more symbolic. This is Jesus talking to the disciples after they're concerned by this. He says, does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. And there in John 6, that's Jesus pointing at Judas, once again, stuff we've been looking at of late. But you see the way the language pivots, right? That very literal read of the previous passage, verses 53 through 59 of John 6, then pivots into something that looks a lot more figurative after that question about why the disciples are offended. Another thing to bear in mind, if we look at John 6 as being our primary passage that we go to say Jesus was being literal at the Last Supper, is you also do have to flip back, what is it for me, 2-3 pages earlier to the Samaritan woman in John 4, and they're talking about this water that's in the well, and they're having really a very lively theological conversation. And she's like, well, my ancestors, they got this well. And are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds? And then Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. I've heard some people be like, it's a metaphor for baptism, but there aren't really other metaphors for baptism that involve drinking the baptismal water elsewhere in the Bible. No, it looks like he's talking about this water of life as a metaphor, and that in the same way as in Matthew 3, when John the Baptist is pushing back on the religious leaders and he says, don't think that just because of your family line that this is the end-all be-all, and we've talked about that a ton. It looks like this kind of follows with that theme of people looking back on family connections to say that's how we know we're right. And Jesus is saying, well, there's a spring of life, of water that is more potent and more lasting and more eternal, and it's being established as being drawn out right here in front of you right now. Well, this is a metaphor that is very sharp and on the nose. There isn't like it'll be like that. He's very literally saying whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. And she misunderstands the metaphor to some extent as well. And then if we go just a couple pages the other way from John 6 over to John 10, don't remember the exact verse, but I know it's John 10. I'm buying time while I skimming. Found it. John 10:9, I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. And the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. You've probably heard that one before. And so there again, he's using an on-the-nose metaphor. He obviously is never transmuted into a literal gate, but he functions metaphorically in that role as the one who's the mediator between God and man. All right, just like when we were trying to steel man the real presence position and needed a little more time, so as we are trying to steel man the symbolic position, the symbolic read on Jesus' words here at the Last Supper in Matthew 26, we are also going to need a little more time, so we're just going to pick it up where we left off tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.